There are disagreements that end cleanly, resolved, forgiven, forgotten. And then there are the other kind, the ones that settle into the background of a relationship or the end of one, and simply stay there, quiet but present, like a stone you've learned to walk around without thinking about it, for so long that you've almost forgotten it's there. John Wayne was not a man known for ambiguity. He had strong opinions, strongly held, and he expressed them with a directness that left very little room for uncertainty. In his films and in his personal life, he was someone who knew where he stood. Some people found this admirable. Others, at various points in his life, found themselves on the wrong end of it. One particular disagreement, with someone he had been close to for years, a colleague, and for a time, a genuine friend, had lingered. It had started over something professional, the way these things often do. A decision that one of them felt was a betrayal, a conversation that went wrong, words said in frustration that neither of them fully walked back. The friendship had cooled. The professional relationship had eventually ended, and what remained was a kind of mutual silence, neither hostile exactly, but unresolved. The kind of silence that, if you're honest with yourself, you can still feel the shape of, even years later. For a long time, John Wayne let it sit. He had, by his own nature, a certain stubbornness that made him good at staying the course in difficult things. But that same quality, in personal relationships, sometimes meant that old hurts stayed exactly where they'd landed, because moving them required admitting something he wasn't always ready to admit. But late in his life, in his last years, illness had changed the pace of things, and there was more time for quiet reflection. He reached out. Quietly, without announcement. Not with a detailed accounting of who had done what, or who owed what to whom. Just a simple message. That he'd been thinking about the old friendship, and that he missed it. And that whatever had happened between them, he'd rather the story not end where it had. The response, by those who knew about it, was described as warm. Not everything was resolved. Some things between people never fully are. But the silence broke. And in breaking, both men apparently felt something they hadn't expected. Lighter. As if the disagreement itself had been heavier than either of them had realized, while they were both too busy being right to notice. That was the realization. That holding on to an old grievance doesn't feel like holding anything most of the time. It just becomes background noise, a low-level weight you carry so constantly that it stops feeling like weight. Until you set it down, and then you feel what you'd been carrying by its sudden absence. Maybe you've felt that too. Maybe there's an old disagreement in your life with a friend, a family member, a former colleague that has simply settled. Not into resolution, but into a kind of armistice you never formally declared. You stopped fighting about it. You stopped bringing it up. But you also didn't fully forgive it. It just became part of the landscape, present, familiar, unexamined. And maybe, when you're honest with yourself, you can feel that weight, the particular heaviness of carrying an old wrong that was never named, or an apology that was never given. or a friendship that ended in unfinished business. Not as grief, exactly. More as a kind of low hum in the background of how you feel about that person, that era of your life, that part of yourself. Here's something gentle to consider. Forgiveness doesn't require the other person to do anything. It doesn't require them to apologize first, or to agree on what happened, or to acknowledge your version of events. It's not really about them at all in the most important sense. It's about whether you choose to keep carrying the weight of what happened, or whether you set it down, not for their benefit, but for yours. That distinction matters. Because many people wait for forgiveness to feel justified, wait for the other person to apologize, to acknowledge what they did, to make it somehow easier. And sometimes that happens. But often it doesn't. And waiting for it can mean carrying the weight indefinitely, which helps no one, least of all yourself. John Wayne was, by reputation and by nature, a man who believed in holding your ground. And in most of the important ways, that served him well. But in this one quiet act, reaching out, without conditions, without requiring the other person to go first, he did something that required a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't show up on screen. The kind that doesn't get applause. The kind that happens privately, with no one watching, because you've decided you're tired of carrying something that was never really doing you any good. Maybe it's time to think about what or who you've been carrying in that quiet way. Not to force anything or to rush toward a resolution that doesn't feel right, but to simply acknowledge honestly that something is still there. And to ask yourself just as honestly whether you'd feel lighter without it. If the answer is yes, and it almost always is, then maybe the question becomes not, do they deserve my forgiveness, but do I deserve to set this down? Because that question is much easier to answer. Almost always, yes. And there's something else worth remembering here. Forgiveness doesn't have to look like anything in particular. It doesn't have to be a conversation, or a letter, or a reconciliation. Sometimes it's entirely private, a decision made in your own heart, without the other person ever knowing, that releases you from a burden you'd been carrying longer than you realized. That counts. It's real. And it changes how the past sits with you, even if nothing on the outside changes at all. There's one more thing worth sitting with. John Wayne, in those final years, made peace with a number of things he'd been carrying. Not just this one disagreement, but a general softening that people who knew him described with some surprise. The stubbornness was still there, but alongside it, something else. A gentler relationship with what he couldn't control, what he couldn't change, and what he had perhaps gotten wrong. That softening tends to happen, for many people, toward the later part of a life. Not because people become weaker, but because they become wiser about what is actually worth holding on to, and what was never as important as it once seemed. If you're watching this tonight, and an old disagreement came to mind, a name, a face, a situation that never quite resolved, maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment. Not to decide anything tonight, just to notice it's still there, and to ask, gently, whether you're ready, even a little bit, to put it down. And if you find yourself on the other side of this, if you're the one who did something that caused a rift, and you've been wondering whether it's too late to say something, here's what John Wayne's quiet gesture suggests. It's almost never too late. The years don't close the door as firmly as we sometimes imagine. A message that says simply, "I've been thinking about you, and I'm sorry for my part in how things ended," even years later, tends to land somewhere softer than you'd expect. Most people, when they receive something like that, don't respond with anger or dismissal. They respond with relief, because they've been carrying something too, and someone being brave enough to go first after all this time often gives them permission to set it down as well. Forgiveness between two people is rarely one-directional, even when it looks that way from the outside. One person reaches out, the other responds, and somewhere in that exchange, both of them quietly set down something they'd been carrying, often for far longer than either realizes. Two people, lighter. One small act of courage, going first. You don't have to have a long conversation. You don't have to revisit every detail of what happened, or assign final blame, or tie everything up with a perfect ending. Most meaningful reconciliations are quieter than that. A simple acknowledgement. An admission that you miss the person, or that you wish things had gone differently. That, surprisingly often, is enough to begin something different. And if the person you'd like to forgive is no longer here to receive it, if what you're carrying involves someone who has passed away, or someone you've completely lost touch with, you can still set the weight down. Privately. In your own time. You could write the letter, even if there's no one to send it to. You could find one person to say the words to out loud. You could simply sit quietly for a moment and decide, just for yourself, in your own heart, that you're done carrying it. That it doesn't belong to you anymore. That counts too. The weight doesn't care whether the other person hears you or not. It only cares whether you chose to set it down. John Wayne spent decades being one of the most iconic symbols of American toughness. Someone who never backed down, never showed weakness, never let anything shake his footing. And in one quiet, private act toward the end of his life, he showed a different kind of strength entirely. The kind that says, "I'm tired of this. I miss what we had. And I'm going first, even though I don't have to." If you're watching this tonight, maybe there's someone you've been missing. Maybe it's time to say so. So take a slow breath. And maybe, this week, let one old weight be just slightly lighter than it was before.